Over the past decade, national attention moved from one crisis to another. Corruption, inquiries, disaster recovery, security failure, electoral transition, policy momentum, global pandemic, institutional scrutiny. Each moment demanded focus. Each moment occupied the headlines. As urgency shifted, so did conversation. The spotlight narrowed, then moved. Again and again. But not every development announces itself as crisis. Some begin quietly, as policy, as opportunity, as regulation, while attention focused on corruption, then disaster, then security, then pandemic survival. Another industry expanded. It did not begin as controversy. It began as economic policy. Licensed, regulated, promoted as revenue-generating. At first, it existed at the margins of national conversation. Philippine Offshore Gaming Operators, POGO, introduced as part of a broader economic strategy. Not yet a headline, while the country debated corruption, recovered from disaster, processed tragedy, elected leadership, fought a drug war, and endured a pandemic. POGO expanded quietly. It would take years before the spotlight returned, and when it did, the questions would be different. In 2016, a new administration began reshaping economic priorities. Among the emerging policies was the formal licensing of offshore gaming operators. The framework already existed in limited form, but expansion would follow. Philippine Offshore Gaming Operators, commonly referred to as POGOs, were licensed to provide online gaming services to clients located outside the Philippines. The operators would be regulated locally. The market would be offshore. The economic promise was straightforward. Licensing fees, regulatory income, employment opportunities, tax contributions. It was presented as revenue diversification. At first, the industry operated without broad national scrutiny. It was technical, regulatory, specialized. Few outside policy circles paid close attention. Oversight fell under established regulatory agencies. Licenses were issued, offices opened, operations expanded. Quietly, as the number of operators increased, so did associated activity. Workforces grew. Office space demand increased. Certain districts began to change. Still, this was not yet a national debate. National attention during these years remained elsewhere. Security policy dominated headlines. Economic reform debates continued. Midterm elections approached. POGO remained peripheral. It began as policy. It expanded as opportunity. And for several years, it did so without occupying the national spotlight. By 2018, the number of licensed operators had increased significantly. Office spaces filled quickly. New businesses occupied entire floors of commercial buildings. The expansion was visible in specific districts. Residential demand followed. Rental prices in certain neighborhoods rose sharply. Landlords adjusted rates. Real estate markets responded to new demand. For some communities, the shift was immediate. Foreign nationals, particularly Chinese workers, arrived in increasing numbers. Restaurants adapted. Signage diversified. Local economies adjusted. What had begun as policy became urban transformation. Questions began to surface. Tax compliance, employment permits, regulatory consistency. Legislators debated how the industry should be classified and how it should contribute. Hearings were held. Revenue figures were discussed. Officials weighed economic benefits against emerging concerns. Still, the issue remained technical. It did not dominate the national conversation. In parallel, other national stories occupied attention. The drug war continued to define headlines. Inflation and fuel prices drew scrutiny. The 2019 midterm elections approached. POGO expanded in the background. By the end of 2019, the industry had grown rapidly. It was visible in certain cities, discussed in legislative circles. But it had not yet become a national reckoning. It was expanding. It was debated, but it was not yet central. And then, in 2020, everything paused. In early 2020, the pandemic halted most economic activity. Lockdowns froze offices, borders tightened, movement stopped. POGO operations were affected immediately. Operations were suspended. Workers were restricted by travel limitations. Regulatory questions intensified. How would licensing continue under lockdown? How would tax obligations be enforced? At the same time, lawmakers revisited revenue contributions. Reports emerged of unpaid taxes. Debates resurfaced over compliance and classification. The pandemic magnified existing tensions. As the country focused on survival, questions arose about which industries continued operating and under what conditions. Some POGO activities resumed partially, others remained suspended. The situation was uneven. Tax enforcement agencies examined arrears. Licensing reviews were discussed. The language shifted from growth to compliance, from opportunity to regulation. Yet, despite suspension and dispute, the industry did not disappear. It remained present, operating within regulatory uncertainty. As lockdown extended into months, attention remained fixed on public health. PhilHealth hearings unfolded. Emergency spending dominated conversation. POGO was discussed, but not yet dominant. The industry had expanded quietly. It had been disrupted by crisis. It had survived regulatory debate, but it had not yet faced its defining moment. By 2022, enforcement actions began to increase. Raids were conducted on several facilities linked to offshore gaming operations. Authorities cited violations of immigration rules, labor standards, and other regulatory requirements. What had once been policy discussion became law enforcement activity. Investigations expanded beyond tax compliance. Reports referenced allegations of illegal detention, online scams, and trafficking-related concerns. The narrative shifted sharply, from revenue generation to criminal exposure. Senate inquiries intensified. Officials from law enforcement and regulatory agencies were summoned. Questions were raised about licensing oversight, about enforcement gaps, about how the industry had grown to such scale. Multiple agencies became involved: immigration authorities, police units, financial investigators. The issue expanded beyond economics, into governance and security. The transformation was stark. An industry once described as regulated was now under criminal scrutiny. The scale of operations surprised many observers. Visibility arrived suddenly. Media coverage intensified. Daily updates replaced occasional reports. Public conversation shifted rapidly. POGO was no longer peripheral. It had become central. For the first time, the industry was framed not as opportunity, but as risk. Economic benefit was no longer the dominant lens. They were security and sovereignty. After years of quiet growth, the spotlight returned, and once again, a new headline took center stage. As investigations expanded, the conversation shifted again. It was no longer limited to licensing or taxation. The questions grew larger. Lawmakers began asking, how did regulatory oversight function at scale? Were enforcement mechanisms sufficient? Did economic policy outpace supervision? The issue became structural. Multiple agencies examined gaps in coordination. Immigration controls, labor compliance, digital operations, financial tracing. The complexity revealed how layered the system had become. Public discussion also expanded. Questions of sovereignty entered the debate. Foreign workforce presence, cross-border operations, regulatory jurisdiction. The issue was no longer local, interagency. Coordination intensified. Policy reviews were announced. Licensing reassessments were proposed. The focus turned toward containment and recalibration. What had once been framed as economic expansion was now examined through risk management. Oversight tightened, permissions narrowed. The regulatory stance shifted. The national issue was no longer about growth. It was about control, about supervision, about whether expansion had outpaced governance, and once again, a familiar question returned. When something grows quietly for years, who is watching closely enough to respond in time? Over the past decade, the country has moved from one defining issue to another. Corruption investigations, disaster recovery, security crisis, electoral transition, policy enforcement, global pandemic, institutional scrutiny. Now, regulatory exposure. Each moment felt decisive. Each moment demanded urgency. Each moment shifted the spotlight. POGO began quietly, expanded steadily, was disrupted by crisis, then exposed at scale. Its arc mirrors others' growth, debate, exposure, reform, shift. Investigations continue. Policy reviews evolve. Administrative measures adjust. But public attention does not remain fixed indefinitely. A nation cannot sustain constant urgency. Attention selects. What it selects becomes immediate. What it leaves becomes procedural. And as new debates emerge, the intensity surrounding POGO will inevitably soften, not because the issue disappears, but because the next headline arrives. The pattern repeats, not through silence, not through erasure, but through sequence. And once again, the question remains: what will we remember after the spotlight moves on?